Nora Hayes signed those divorce papers in silence. No arguing, no tears. But as she walked out of the courthouse, 3 black armored SUVs surrounded the building. The man who stepped out, Lorenzo Moretti, America's most powerful mafia boss, looked Gavin Cross straight in the eye and uttered 4 words that paralyzed him. "She's my little sister." Gavin had just thrown away the most dangerous woman he had ever met. If you want to know what happens next, hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. Don't go anywhere. You won't want to miss this. The ring hit the marble floor of Suffolk County Courthouse with a sound that was embarrassingly small for what it was supposed to mean. It skipped once, twice, rolled in a lazy half circle beneath the plaintiff's table, and came to rest against the baseboard like a piece of loose change that wasn't worth picking up. Gavin Cross watched it stop and felt nothing except a slight irritation that it hadn't gone farther. He'd meant for it to land out in the center of the aisle. He'd rehearsed the gesture in the mirror of his Back Bay penthouse 3 times that morning. It was supposed to feel cinematic, final, the punctuation mark on 12 years of a mistake he'd been too proud to admit until recently. Instead, it just looked petty. Nora didn't flinch. That was the thing about her that had always gotten under his skin. The way she refused to perform distress for him. He'd expected tears, or at minimum the tight, white-knuckled stillness of someone fighting not to cry. He got neither. She sat across the plaintiff's table in a gray wool dress that probably cost $40. Her dark hair pulled back the way she always wore it when she was trying to disappear into a room, and she watched the ring roll and settle with the mild, disconnected expression of someone observing weather through a window that didn't concern her. Her attorney, a small, wiry woman named Patricia Cho, who had said almost nothing through 2 hours of proceedings, placed a steadying hand on the table beside Nora's wrist without actually touching it. A proximity of support. Nora didn't need it. 12 years, Gavin said, and his voice carried the particular resonance of a man who had spent a lot of money learning how to use a room. His own attorney, Marcus Webb, had advised him twice this morning to let the paperwork do the talking. Gavin had smiled and nodded and intended to do exactly as he pleased. 12 years, and what did you contribute, Nora? Honestly, what was your contribution to any of this? Patricia Cho opened her mouth. The judge, a weathered woman in her 60s named Honorable Claire Brennan, looked up from her papers with the patience of someone who had seen this particular theater before and found it exhausting. Mr. Cross, Judge Brennan's voice was flat. We are finalizing terms, not conducting a eulogy. Gavin smiled. The smile of a man who understood that judges were inconveniences to be navigated around, not authorities to be obeyed. He was 43 years old, the CEO of Cross Meridian Technologies, a company he had taken from a 3-person startup in a Cambridge basement to a publicly traded firm worth $600 million. He had been profiled in Forbes twice. He owned homes in 3 states. He had spent the last 2 years of his marriage doing what men like him eventually did, building something newer and shinier and less complicated, in this case an executive assistant named Vanessa Doyle, who wore expensive perfume and never asked him hard questions. My client, Marcus Webb said smoothly, sliding a folder across the table, is prepared to offer a settlement consistent with Mrs. Cross's actual contributions to the marital estate, which our financial review has established as minimal. The terms include a one-time payment of $140,000, no ongoing support, and Mrs. Cross retains personal property as itemized in Exhibit C. Patricia Cho said quietly, the marital home alone appraised at $4.2 million. Mrs. Cross's name was not on the deed. Because Mr. Cross asked her to remove it in 2019, citing a restructuring of Patricia. Nora's voice was so low it barely registered in the room. Patricia Cho stopped. She looked at her client with an expression that suggested this was not the first time Nora had pulled this particular break, and that it frustrated her professionally every single time. It's fine, Nora said. It wasn't fine. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't fine. Judge Brennan's pen had paused above her legal pad. Marcus Webb looked at Nora the way predators look at prey that has stopped running, briefly confused, then recalculating. Gavin felt the faint unease of a man who has prepared extensively for a fight and found his opponent has simply declined to engage. Nora, he said, and despite himself there was something almost genuine in his voice, some residual reflex of the person he'd been before money taught him new habits. "I'm trying to make this clean." She looked at him then. Really looked at him, in a way she hadn't done in years, in a way that made him remember, suddenly and uncomfortably, that she had been the only person who ever saw him clearly and chose him anyway. "I know you are," she said. She picked up the pen and signed. The whole thing took 11 minutes from the moment the ring hit the floor to the moment Nora Hayes, she had already, quietly, reverted to her maiden name in her own mind, stood up from the plaintiff's table, reached beneath her chair, and lifted a manila folder that had been sitting there the entire time, unnoticed, like a detail in a room you don't register until suddenly it's the only thing you can see. It was worn at the edges, creased along the spine like something carried in a bag for a long time. She tucked it under her arm, nodded once to Patricia Cho, and walked toward the courtroom's double doors without looking back at Gavin Cross, the marble floor, or the ring that was still lying against the baseboard where it had come to rest. Gavin watched her go and felt the particular lightness of a man who has just completed a transaction he believes was entirely in his favor. He would spend the rest of his life recalibrating that belief. Outside, the November air hit the courthouse steps like a reprimand, hard, cold, carrying the smell of the harbor and diesel exhaust and the particular gray misery of a Boston morning that has decided to be genuinely unpleasant about it. Nora came through the courthouse doors and stood at the top of the steps, and for just a moment, alone, without Patricia, without anyone watching, she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. 12 years. She'd been 29 when she married Gavin Cross, and 29 felt like a different person, a woman who had believed that love could be enough to compensate for the fundamental incompatibility of two people who wanted completely different things from the world. She hadn't been wrong to believe it. She'd just been wrong about Gavin being someone who was capable of wanting what she wanted. She breathed. Cold air filled her lungs. She exhaled and watched the vapor disappear. The manila folder was steady under her arm. Then the black SUVs came. Not one. Not two. 3 of them, identical, arriving from 3 different directions simultaneously with the kind of quiet coordination that spoke of professional planning rather than coincidence. They were the kind of vehicles that didn't have license plates you could read quickly and don't belong to anyone who needs to announce themselves. They pulled up to the courthouse with the unhurried authority of vehicles that have never once worried about a parking ticket, and they stopped, and for 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. The men who stepped out were large, dressed in black suits that fit too well to be off the rack, and moved with the careful, measured economy of people who are accustomed to anticipating violence rather than reacting to it. 6 of them arranged themselves on the courthouse steps and along the sidewalk with the practiced geometry of a security detail that knows exactly where all the angles are. Nora didn't move. She stood at the top of the steps and watched all of this happen the way you watch something you've been expecting for a long time. The rear door of the center vehicle opened last. The man who stepped out was tall. Not exaggeratedly so, but tall in the way that some men are tall where it functions as a kind of authority, where the physical fact of their height communicates something about how seriously they take up space in the world. He was in his mid-50s, with silver threading through dark hair, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His face was the kind that had been handsome once, and was now something more interesting than handsome. Weathered, watchful, the face of a man who had learned to read rooms the way other people read books. Lorenzo Moretti walked directly toward Nora Hayes with the unhesitating certainty of a man who has never once been uncertain about where he belongs. On the courthouse steps behind Nora, Gavin Cross had appeared. He'd come through those doors just in time to see the vehicles arrive, and he stood now with Marcus Webb slightly behind him, watching this unfold with the baffled, vaguely annoyed expression of a man who believes he is the center of any given situation and is only just beginning to suspect that he might not be. Lorenzo reached Nora. Without hesitation, without performance, without the self-conscious quality of a gesture staged for an audience, he pulled her into an embrace that was immediate and unguarded, his arms coming around her the way people embrace someone they were afraid they might lose, or someone they haven't seen in longer than they wanted. Nora, who had not cried once during 2 hours of proceedings in which her marriage was formally reduced to a transaction, pressed her face into her brother's shoulder and breathed for a moment like someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time. Lorenzo stepped back, held her by the shoulders, looked at her face with the quiet, assessing attention of someone checking for damage. "You good?" he said. Just that. 2 words. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her for another second like he wasn't entirely convinced, and then he turned. He looked at Gavin Cross with eyes that had the particular quality of coldness that isn't performed or affected, but is instead simply the natural resting temperature of a man who has spent 30 years making decisions that other people found very difficult to live with. "She's my little sister," Lorenzo said. He said it conversationally, quietly, without emphasis or threat, the way you state a fact about weather or geography. A thing that simply is, and has always been, and doesn't require anyone's permission or acknowledgement to continue being true. The color left Gavin Cross's face in stages. It started at his forehead and moved downward, the particular draining pallor of a man whose brain has just received information that contradicts every assumption his morning was built on and is working very hard to process the implications. Because Gavin Cross was a man who had made it his business to know things. He had teams of people, lawyers, researchers, a private security consultant he paid very well, whose job it was to ensure he was never surprised. He knew the valuations of competing firms before they were announced. He knew which city council members were available for the right kind of conversation. He knew things. He had not known this. He had known Nora Cross, technically, for the last 12 years, as a woman from a modest background in Western Massachusetts, a woman who had worked as a librarian when they met, a woman with no family to speak of because she had described her family as complicated and distant, and Gavin, who had found family complexity personally relatable, had never pushed. He had known her as quiet and self-contained and intelligent in ways that had charmed him briefly before those same qualities began to feel like criticism by implication. He had known her as someone who did not make scenes, who did not threaten, who absorbed what life handed her with the stillness that he had, in the particular arrogance of men who mistake quietness for weakness, interpreted as an absence of power. Lorenzo Moretti was not a name that people in Gavin's world said casually. He was the kind of name that came up in certain conversations that Gavin had occasionally been adjacent to, in rooms he was invited into because of his money and his connections. Rooms where people discussed the way certain business interests in this country operated beneath the official architecture of the legitimate economy. Lorenzo Moretti was the kind of name that ended sentences, that answered questions, that, when it appeared in a conversation, made every other person in that conversation briefly reassess their choices. "I don't," Gavin started. "No," Lorenzo said. "You don't." He looked at Gavin for another moment with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who is deciding something he has already decided but is being thorough about it. Then he turned back to Nora, offered her his arm, and walked her down the courthouse steps toward the center vehicle. Gavin Cross stood at the top of those steps in the cold November air and watched the woman he had just publicly discarded walk away under the protection of one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the United States of America, and for the first time in a very long time, possibly the first time since he was young enough to be genuinely uncertain about anything, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Marcus Webb, to his credit, said nothing. The SUVs left the way they'd arrived, without announcement, without urgency, simply gone, as though they'd never been there at all. Inside the middle vehicle, Nora sat with her brother in the particular silence of two people who understand each other well enough not to require immediate words. The manila folder was on the seat beside her. Lorenzo's eyes were on it. "You're going to tell me you handled it," he said. "I handled it." That's not an answer. "Lorenzo." She turned to look at him. "I handled it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Boston streets moved past. The brownstones and the coffee shops and the ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea anything significant had just happened in one of its courtrooms. "He humiliated you in there," Lorenzo said. "Yes." "And you signed anyway." "Yes." Nora, I need you to hear me. Her voice was calm, but it carried something underneath it, something that had been accumulating for a long time, compressed and precise. I know what's in that folder. I know what I've spent 3 years putting together, and I know what you want to do with it. Lorenzo looked out the window. I'm not going to let you, she said. Not like that. You understand who he is, Lorenzo said. What he's done. The money he moved offshore, the investors he defrauded, 200 people who go to work every day not knowing their company is a shell game. He paused. Not to mention what he did to you. He's going to answer for everything in that folder, Nora said. But through the right channels, the board, the SEC, legal processes that protect those 200 people's jobs even after Gavin is gone. She touched the folder without picking it up. I won't use you to destroy him. That's not what I came back for. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment. You know I could make a single phone call. I know. And every investor, every bank, Lorenzo. She said his name the way older siblings say it, the particular inflection of someone who has known you since before you knew yourself. I know. He exhaled, long and slow. Fine, he said. Your way. My way, she agreed. The car moved through downtown Boston, and neither of them spoke for a while. And outside the windows, the city went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that two of the most consequential decisions of several hundred people's lives had just been made in the back of an armored SUV, by a woman with a worn manila folder and a very specific idea about what justice was supposed to look like. In the courthouse 3 miles behind them, Gavin Cross was still standing on the steps. He was on his phone. He'd made 3 calls in quick succession, and all 3 had gone straight to voicemail, which was unusual and should have told him something. His private security consultant, his chief financial officer, the senior vice president of investor relations, a man named Doug Harrell, who never missed calls. Gavin didn't register the pattern yet. He was still processing the central fact, Lorenzo Moretti, Nora, sister, and the way those 3 elements reconfigured everything he thought he understood about the last 12 years. Marcus Webb had gone for his car. The courthouse steps were nearly empty. A few strangers passed below, callers up against the cold, not looking at him. His phone buzzed. Not a call. A text, from a number he didn't recognize. The folder she was carrying. You should think very carefully about what's in it. Gavin stared at the message. His 4th call, to Vanessa, connected on the first ring. Did you see the news? Was the first thing she said, and her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. A thinness, a register of something close to panic, trying very hard not to be panic. What news? He said. What are you talking about? Nothing's happened yet. Gavin. Vanessa's voice dropped. 3 board members have requested an emergency meeting this morning, before noon. He looked at the phone in his hand. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not possible. I control the board. I have the votes. There's no way they could... Gavin. Her voice was different now, flat, careful. One of the board members received something this morning, an envelope. I don't know what's in it, but Harold called me 20 minutes ago, and he was terrified. I've never heard him sound like that. He said... She paused, and he heard her take a breath. He said, whoever sent it knew everything. The November air was very cold. Below the courthouse steps, a black car idled at the curb. It had been there when Gavin came out, and he hadn't paid attention to it, and now he looked at it and noticed that the engine was running and the windows were dark, and that it hadn't moved once in the 12 minutes he'd been standing here. He looked away. I need you to call Marcus, he said. His voice was almost steady. And I need you to say nothing to anyone about anything until I get back to the office. Gavin. Nothing, Vanessa. Do you understand me? A pause. Yes, she said. He hung up, put the phone in his pocket, looked out at the street where the black SUVs had been and weren't anymore. The thing about a manila folder, worn at the edges and creased along the spine as though it had been carried for a long time, is that it's a remarkably unassuming object. You could sit through 2 hours of divorce proceedings and never once think about it. You could write a check, metaphorically, for $140,000 and feel good about your generosity and walk out of a courtroom convinced you'd won and the folder could just sit there beneath the table, completely unremarkable. You'd never know. You'd never know until a board member opened an envelope and a CFO called someone in a panic, and a phone went straight to voicemail, and by that point the folder was already across town in an armored vehicle, and the woman who'd been carrying it was somewhere above New England in a private jet, looking out a window at the gray Atlantic below, with 3 years of her life's careful work already beginning to do exactly what she'd designed it to do. But Gavin didn't know any of that yet. He stood on the courthouse steps in the cold and thought about a woman who had never argued, never threatened, never once given him a single reason to believe she was anything other than what she appeared to be. And he tried very hard not to think about the fact that men who have underestimated quiet women have always, in the end, paid for it. His phone buzzed again. A different number. He looked at the screen. It was the chairman of his board. Gavin Cross answered the call with a steady hand and a gut that had gone cold as the November air. And in the moment before the chairman spoke, in the single second of silence on the line, he felt, for the first time in 12 years, genuinely, completely afraid. The board chairman's name was Richard Calloway, and he'd been with Cross Meridian since the Series B round, back when the company was still small enough that everyone knew everyone, and Gavin Cross was still the kind of man who remembered your wife's name and your kid's school. That was a long time ago. Calloway was 61 now, with the careful, deliberate manner of a man who had survived multiple market crashes by being the least emotional person in any given room. And when his voice came through the phone, it carried something Gavin had never heard in it before. Not anger, not even concern. Fear. "We need you in the building," Calloway said. "Not this afternoon. Now." "Richard, Gavin." The way he said the name left no room for negotiation. "I have David Park and Susan Mercer already in the conference room. We've been contacted by someone who claims to have material relevant to the company's financial reporting. Significant material. I need you here in 20 minutes. Gavin's jaw tightened. David Park was the audit committee chair. Susan Mercer was the board's outside legal counsel. The specific combination of those two people in a conference room was not a combination that preceded good news. "What kind of material?" Gavin said. A pause. Brief but weighted. "The kind that requires you to be here in person," Calloway said. "Not on the phone. Here." The call ended. Marcus Webb was still on the courthouse steps, keys in hand, when Gavin reached him. The attorney read his face with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been reading clients' faces for 30 years and has learned to distinguish between the various categories of bad. "How bad?" Webb asked. "I don't know yet." "That's the worst kind," Webb said. They took Webb's car. Neither of them spoke for the first 6 blocks. The Boston traffic was the ordinary mid-morning kind. Delivery trucks, cabs, the grinding, indifferent machinery of a city that had no interest in anyone's personal crisis. Gavin watched it pass and tried to think clearly, and found that the image of Lorenzo Moretti's face kept interrupting his thinking. Those cold, assessing eyes, the way he'd looked at Gavin with the specific quality of a man who has already made a decision and is simply observing the consequences unfold. "She's my little sister." He turned it over in his mind the way you turn a stone over looking for what's underneath. 12 years. He'd known Nora for 12 years, and he had not known this. He thought about the times she'd taken calls in other rooms, always briefly, always with a particular stillness afterward, like someone resettling themselves after turbulence. He thought about the way she'd never needed anything from him financially. Not really, even before the company took off, even when money was actually difficult. She'd been frugal in a way he'd attributed to her background, to the modest Western Massachusetts upbringing she'd described in terms that were always slightly vague. He thought about the manila folder. He thought about the way she'd carried it, like it wasn't heavy, like she'd been carrying it long enough that the weight had become unremarkable. "The folder," he said. Webb glanced at him. "Nora had a folder in the courtroom. I need to know what was in it." "I noticed it," Webb said carefully. "I didn't have reason to—" "Find out." Gavin's voice was flat. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, find out what she's been putting together." Webb was quiet for a moment. "If she's already distributed the contents, then I need to know that too." Gavin looked out the window. I need to know everything she knows before I walk into that conference room. Webb pulled out his phone. Cross Meridian Technologies occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in the Seaport District, the kind of building that had been designed to communicate permanence and confidence, the architectural equivalent of a firm handshake. Gavin had chosen it specifically for that reason. He had a gift for understanding the language of spaces, for knowing how environments shaped perception. He had used that gift to build something genuinely impressive, and beneath the fraud and the offshore accounts and the financial architectures that didn't survive close examination, there was a real company, real technology, real people, real work. That was the thing about Gavin Cross that made him genuinely complicated rather than simply corrupt. He had built something real, and then he had been afraid to let it be merely real, and the distance between those two things was where the damage lived. He walked through the lobby without stopping at reception. The security staff saw him and said nothing. The elevator doors closed, and he stood alone in the mirrored interior and looked at his own reflection, and didn't recognize entirely the man looking back at him. The 42nd floor conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the harbor. On a clear day, it was a view that made people stop talking and just stand there for a moment, which was part of why Gavin had always used this room for negotiations. The view gave him a half-second of control over anyone who hadn't seen it before. Today the harbor was gray and choppy, and the clouds were low, and the view just looked like weather. Richard Calloway was standing at the head of the table. David Park sat to his left, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the specific kind of composure that accountants develop when they have been looking at numbers that don't add up and are waiting to discuss them with someone. Susan Mercer was at the far end, a yellow legal pad in front of her, already half covered in notes. She had a way of taking notes that suggested she was documenting rather than simply recording, building a record, not just keeping one. On the table between them was an envelope, already open. The contents, a stack of documents, perhaps 30 pages, were fanned slightly, as though someone had gone through them quickly and then tried to restore them to order. Gavin looked at the documents. He looked at Calloway. "Close the door," Calloway said. Webb, who had come up with him, stepped forward. "Richard, as Gavin's counsel, I think it would be appropriate—" "Marcus?" Calloway's voice was not unkind. "Sit down." Webb sat. Gavin remained standing. He had learned a long time ago that the person standing in a room of seated people had a specific advantage, and habits built over decades don't dissolve just because the ground has shifted. "Who sent this?" he said. Park slid a single page across the table. It was a cover letter, typed, unsigned. 3 sentences. The attached documents detail financial irregularities in Cross Meridian's Q4 reporting for fiscal years 2021 through 2024. They include wire transfer records, internal correspondence, and offshore account documentation. The board's fiduciary duty is clear. Gavin read it twice. His face did not change. This was something he'd worked on, the ability to process devastating information without telegraphing it, to give himself time to think while the room watched his expression and found it unremarkable. It was a useful skill. He'd built it over years, but his hands, which were resting on the conference table, pressed down slightly harder than usual, and Park, who was the kind of man who noticed things like that, noticed. "Gavin," Calloway said, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to understand that what happens in this room in the next 10 minutes is going to determine whether this stays a board matter or becomes something significantly more public." "Ask it," Gavin said. The offshore transfers detailed in these documents, the accounts in the Cayman structure, the redirected licensing revenue, the Q4 adjustments. Did you know about them? The room was absolutely quiet. Through the windows, a cargo ship was moving slowly across the harbor. Gavin watched it for a second. "I want to review the documents," he said. "Gavin, Richard." His voice was careful and controlled, and underneath it, like water moving under ice, was something that was close to panic but hadn't broken through yet. "I want to review the documents before I respond to any specific characterizations. That is a reasonable request, and you know it." Calloway and Park exchanged a look. Mercer, who had not spoken since Gavin entered the room, said quietly, We've already contacted outside forensic accountants. They can be here by 3. She paused. We also received a call this morning from an attorney at the SEC. They say they've been sent the same package. There it was. Gavin felt it land. Not the panic, not yet, but the physical reality of the situation, the actual weight of it, settling onto him like something architectural, like a structure coming down not all at once, but in the specific terrible sequence of a controlled demolition. He thought about the manila folder. He thought about the worn edges, the crease along the spine. 3 years, he thought. She'd been building this for 3 years. I need 5 minutes, he said. Gavin, 5 minutes. His voice was still steady, the steadiest thing in the room. Then we'll talk. He walked out of the conference room and into the hallway and found an empty office 3 doors down and went inside and closed the door and stood there in the middle of the floor with his heart doing something it had never done before. Not racing exactly, but stuttering, missing beats in a way that felt deeply wrong, like a machine that has been running past its tolerance for too long and is only now, in the quiet, registering the damage. He called Vanessa. She picked up on half a ring, which told him she'd been holding the phone. Where are you? He said. My office. Her voice was tight, controlled, the voice of someone who has been maintaining control for several hours and is running low on the reserves required to do it. Gavin, people are looking at me differently this morning. Harold walked past my office twice and didn't make eye contact. That never happens. Listen to me, he said. I need you to go to your computer right now. Your personal email, not your work account. Delete anything that references the Q4 adjustments. Anything. Archive folders, sent items, everything. A pause that lasted 2 seconds too long. Vanessa. I already did, she said, 2 hours ago. Before you called. He absorbed this. Good. Gavin. Her voice changed. The controls slipped by about a degree. How bad is this? He looked at the wall of the empty office. Someone's generic landscape print, a field in autumn. The kind of artwork that exists to fill space without demanding attention. Bad, he said. Another pause. The board is already in a room with outside counsel and a forensic accountant on the way. He rubbed his face with his free hand, and the SEC has the same documents. He heard her breath catch. Then, how did they get them? Nora, he said. Just the name. Flat and complete. The silence on the line had a specific quality to it. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated. The silence of someone processing the confirmation of a thing they'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to examine too closely. She's been planning this, Vanessa said, for a long time. How long? He thought about it. About every dinner party, every corporate event, every quarterly review she'd sat beside him for, saying almost nothing, watching everything with those level, attentive eyes that he had read as passivity and were, apparently, something else entirely. I don't know, he said. Long enough. He went back into the conference room and spent 4 hours there, during which Marcus Webb arrived with a crisis attorney named Helena Strauss, who billed $500 an hour and had a face like someone who had heard every possible version of this conversation and found them all tedious. Gavin answered questions carefully. He did not lie outright. He had enough professional instinct to know that outright lies in this particular room with these particular people would create a second problem on top of the first one. But he shaped his answers. He hedged. He implied that certain decisions had been made by a financial team he had trusted without sufficient oversight, which was technically adjacent to the truth in the specific way that all good lies are adjacent to the truth. It wasn't enough. He could see that in Park's face, in Mercer's notes, which kept growing. By 4 in the afternoon, when the forensic accountant, a compact, methodical woman named Dr. Iris Chiang, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke only when she had something specific to say, arrived and began going through the documents with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has all the time in the world and has learned that the numbers always tell the truth eventually, Gavin understood that what he was doing was not saving himself. It was buying time. He was buying time, and the question of what he was going to do with it was one he didn't yet have an answer to. He left the building at 6:17, just ahead of the first journalist. He didn't see her, but Webb did, and Webb said nothing about it until they were in the car, And then he said, "There's a reporter from the Globe outside, business desk." Gavin looked out the window. "How?" he said. "The SEC contact, probably." Webb's voice was neutral and professional, and beneath it Gavin could hear, just barely, the very faint frequency of a man who has been an attorney for a long time and has learned to emotionally distance himself from the moments when clients begin to fall. Or someone inside the building. These things move fast once they start moving. They sat in traffic on Congress Street for 11 minutes without speaking. Then Gavin's phone lit up with a notification. A business news alert, the kind he'd set up years ago to track competitor coverage. Except it wasn't a competitor. Cross Meridian CEO under scrutiny as board calls emergency session, sources. He read the headline twice. The story had a timestamp of 40 minutes ago. "How?" he said again, but this time it wasn't a question. Someone had been watching the building. Someone had known the board was meeting. Someone had known enough to be ready before the session even ended. He thought about Lorenzo Moretti, about the way the man had stood on the courthouse steps and said nothing threatening and managed to be more threatening than anything Gavin Cross had ever encountered. He thought about Nora and the manila folder and 3 years of careful, patient work. And then his phone rang again. Unknown number. He answered it before he could decide not to. "Mr. Cross," a woman's voice, measured, professional. "My name is Agent Diana Walsh. I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. I'd like to schedule a conversation at your earliest convenience." The words were polite. The tone was not exactly impolite. It was the tone of someone for whom courtesy is a tool rather than a reflex, applied in the specific way that people apply tools when they want results. "I'll have my attorney contact your office," Gavin said, on reflex because that was what you said. "Of course," Agent Walsh said. "We'd also like you to be aware that we've frozen the offshore accounts associated with the Meridian capital structure as of this afternoon, pending investigation." As a courtesy. She said as a courtesy the way people say things they mean ironically, but professionally. The call ended. Webb had heard enough. He was already typing on his phone, one-handed. Gavin sat in the back of the car with the frozen account notification on his screen and the first genuine understanding that the architecture of his life, the money, the company, the insulation of power and wealth that he had spent 2 decades building, had structural damage he had not fully appreciated until this exact moment, when he was watching it move from theoretical to real in real time. What he didn't know, because no one had told him and he hadn't yet found anyone who could, was that across town in a Beacon Hill townhouse that Lorenzo Moretti maintained as a Boston residence, Nora Hayes was sitting across from a woman named Greta Solano, who was an attorney from the legitimate firm Lorenzo retained for all interactions that needed to remain above the legal waterline, and they were discussing the second envelope. Not the one that had gone to the board. That envelope had been the financial documentation, the offshore accounts, the Q4 adjustments, the wire transfers. Clean, verifiable, devastatingly specific. The second envelope was different. "You understand," Greta said, "that if we send this one, it changes the calculus entirely. The first envelope is about the company. The second one is about the employees," Nora said, "among other things." Greta looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses. "The communications between Cross and Doyle that you included in the second package, the ones discussing the restructuring plans. If the board sees those, it won't just be about financial fraud anymore." Nora was quiet for a moment. The restructuring plans. She'd found them 18 months ago, buried in a backup drive that Gavin had stopped using and left in a box in the home office he rarely visited. It had taken her 3 weeks to access it. The documents inside had taken another 3 weeks to fully understand. When she did understand them, when she grasped the full shape of what Gavin and Vanessa had been planning, the workforce reduction, the asset stripping, the plan to hollow out the company's core operations and sell the intellectual property to a competitor at a premium while 200 people were handed termination notices on a Friday. She had experienced something that wasn't exactly anger and wasn't exactly grief, but occupied the specific space between them where people sometimes make decisions that change everything. She had not told Lorenzo, not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew exactly what Lorenzo would have done with that information, and it would not have looked like the inside of a courtroom. "Send it," Nora said. Greta looked at her for a moment. This triggers the full board response. They'll almost certainly remove him. I know. His attorneys will argue, Greta. Nora folded her hands on the table. They were steady, completely still. Send it. Greta nodded once and reached for the phone. Upstairs, Lorenzo was having a different conversation. His was conducted standing, which was how he conducted all conversations he found genuinely significant, moving slowly between the window and the far wall of the study, like a man who thinks better on his feet. Across from him sat a man named Caruso. No first name ever used in Lorenzo's presence, just Caruso, who handled the specific category of situations that required resources and discretion that couldn't be sourced through legitimate channels. The Doyle woman, Lorenzo said. Caruso waited. She's going to panic. Lorenzo stopped at the window. She's already panicking. Scared people do unpredictable things. You want her watched. I want to know if she does anything that affects my sister's interests. He turned from the window. Nothing more than that. Nora's managing this her way. I've agreed to that. Caruso nodded slowly. The specific quality of his nod communicated that he understood both what was being said and the significant category of things that weren't being said. And Cross himself? Caruso asked. Not our problem tonight, Lorenzo said. He'll do what scared men do. Run in a direction. We'll see which one. He was right about that. Across the city, in the Back Bay penthouse, Gavin Cross was doing exactly that, running in a direction. The direction was toward Vanessa, who had come to the penthouse at 7 and was now sitting on the white couch in the living room that Nora had furnished, and the decorator had subsequently refurnished at Vanessa's suggestion, holding a glass of wine with both hands the way people hold things when they need their hands to have something to do. We need to align our stories, she said. We don't have stories. We have facts. He was pacing. He'd been pacing since she arrived. The documentation she gave them is real, all of it. Vanessa was quiet. There's nothing to align, he continued, because there's nothing to contradict. She had everything. She can't have had everything. She had the offshore structure. She had the wire transfers. She had the Q4 internal memos, Vanessa, which means she had access to my internal communications at some point. He stopped pacing. How? The word landed in the room. Vanessa looked into her wine. I don't know. Think. Her jaw tightened. I said I don't know. With 3 years of documentation from a woman who supposedly had no idea what was happening inside this company, and you don't know how it... I said I don't know. Her voice cracked on the last word. She set the wine down hard enough that it nearly tipped. Gavin, stop looking at me like that. Like what? Like I'm the problem here. She stood up. You built the structure. You moved the money. You made the plans. Her voice was getting louder, and she seemed to know it and not be able to stop it. I helped. Yes, I was part of it, but don't stand there looking at me like this started with me. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. It didn't start with you. The air between them shifted slightly. It started, he said, the day I married a woman I didn't understand and spent 12 years assuming that meant she had nothing to understand. Vanessa sat back down. The anger moved out of her face as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by something more complicated. Fear, yes, but beneath it something that might have been a kind of bleak recognition, the look of someone seeing clearly for the first time and finding the view worse than they expected. What do we do? She said. Quietly now. He opened his mouth to answer. His phone lit up with a notification. Then another. Then 3. In rapid succession. He looked at the screen. The messages were from 5 different board members, arriving within seconds of each other, with a uniformity that could only mean they'd been triggered by the same event. They'd all received something at the same time, something that had prompted them all independently to reach for their phones and contact him immediately. The text from Calloway came in last and said only, "Call me, now." Gavin Cross stood in his living room in his expensive penthouse above the Back Bay, with his phone lighting up like something on fire, and understood, with the specific, sick clarity of a man whose understanding has arrived about 4 hours too late to do him any good, that the first envelope had been the warning. Whatever had just landed in the board members' phones and inboxes was the thing Nora had actually been saving. And this time, he had a feeling there was no version of the next conversation that ended with him still in charge of anything at all. Calloway picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been holding the phone. "Tell me what you just received," Gavin said. No preamble, no performance. He was done with performance tonight. "A second package." Calloway's voice had changed since the afternoon. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something harder. The particular tone of a man who has moved past the shock of bad news and arrived at the cold, functional anger of someone deciding what comes next. Different from the first one. More personal. Define personal. A pause. Long enough to mean something. "There are communications, Gavin, between you and Doyle, going back approximately 2 years. Another pause. "The restructuring documents, the workforce reduction plan, the IP sale conversations with Hendricks Group." The Hendricks Group. Gavin went very still. Vanessa was watching him from across the room, reading his face with the nervous attention of someone who has learned to calibrate their own emotional state against the barometric pressure of another person's expression. She saw something shift in him that she hadn't seen before. Not panic, not anger, but a kind of absolute stillness. The stillness of an animal that has just understood the full dimensions of the trap it's in. "Richard," Gavin said carefully, "those communications, they were exploratory, strategic planning exercises. Nothing was—" "Gavin," Calloway's voice cut through cleanly. "The plan detailed a 40% workforce reduction, asset liquidation of the core engineering division, and an IP transfer that would have made the company functionally insolvent within 18 months. And then there are the communications with Doyle about the timing, specifically the timing relative to when the employees' stock options would have vested." He stopped. "You were going to do it 3 weeks before the vesting date." The room was very quiet. Vanessa had gone white. Gavin said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make the thing described sound like anything other than what it was. 200 people. Their retirement savings, their equity, the thing they'd been told for years was coming. 3 weeks before it arrived, it would have been gone, transferred and liquidated and restructured into a form that paid out to a Cayman account, while the people who built the company were handed boxes for their desks. He had told himself, in the way that people tell themselves things that require significant maintenance to continue believing, that it would never actually happen. It was contingency planning. A theoretical architecture. Men in his position built these models all the time. You had to know your options, had to understand the exit strategies. It was responsible management. It was, "The board is convening at 8 tomorrow morning," Calloway said. "I'm telling you as a courtesy, Gavin, because of the history, because I remember who you were when we started this together." A breath. "But you need to understand what the vote is going to be." The call ended. Gavin lowered the phone. Vanessa was still watching him. Her hands were clasped in her lap now, pressed together hard, the knuckles showing the strain. "They have the Hendricks conversations," he said. Her face didn't change. Not one muscle. The specific, terrible stillness of someone who has heard something they already knew was coming and has been bracing for it so long that the arrival of the thing produces not shock, but a kind of exhausted collapse of tension. Gavin registered that stillness. He registered the absence of surprise in it. He looked at her with new eyes. The eyes of a man who has just had one realization and is, with a horrible efficiency, immediately pivoting toward the next one. "Vanessa," he said. "Gavin. The internal communications." He took a step toward her. Not aggressive. Careful. The careful approach of someone who is not yet certain and is testing the air. The ones Nora had. The Q4 memos. The financial structure documents. He stopped. Those were on encrypted internal servers. You had to have two-factor authentication to access them. You and I and Harold and the 2 account executives who've been with the company since the beginning." She said nothing. "I've known Harold for 15 years, Gavin said. "I know what he is. He would not—" He stopped again. His breath was doing something irregular. He could feel it in his chest. "The Hendricks conversations, those were on your personal laptop, your private account. Things I told you in person and then followed up in writing because you asked me to." He looked at her. "Because you said you wanted a record." The word record sat in the room between them. Vanessa stood up. "I need you to stop," she said. "You gave her access. His voice was very quiet now, almost gentle. Sometimes the quietest voices are the most frightening. Not all of it. You couldn't have given her all of it. But enough. The right documents in the right sequence to build the case she needed. He tilted his head slightly. How long? Gavin, how long have you been talking to my wife? The word wife landed with a particular weight coming from him. The man who had thrown the ring across a courthouse floor 8 hours ago, who had called her a burden in front of a judge. He said it now like it meant something, like he was only understanding in this moment that it had always meant something. Vanessa's composure broke, not all at once, in sections. The careful professional surface cracking along seams she'd been maintaining for a long time, the pieces separating, and underneath them not the woman he thought he knew, but something more complicated, something older, with more layers worn by a longer history than the 2 years he'd been counting. 8 months, she said. 8 months. The penthouse was very still. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and illuminated, doing what cities do. She contacted me, Vanessa said. Her voice had changed. The control was gone. What was left was rawer, rougher, the voice of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally set it down, regardless of whether setting it down was wise. 7 months before the divorce proceedings started, she called me on a number I don't know how she had. I didn't answer the first time, or the second. But you answered the third time, Gavin said. She knew things. Vanessa pressed her hands together again tighter. About the Hendricks deal, about the vesting timeline. She knew what we were planning to do to those people, Gavin. She knew, and she called me and she asked me one question. What question? Vanessa looked at him directly. For the first time in months, maybe longer, she looked at him the way people look at things they've decided to see clearly. She asked me if I could live with it, Vanessa said. That's all? No threats? No leverage? No. She shook her head. Just that. Can you live with it? And then she said she was going to stop it whether I helped her or not, but that if I helped her, the people who needed protection would get it faster, the employees, the ones on the vesting schedule. Gavin said nothing. I have a sister, Vanessa said. She's 31. She worked 12 years for a company in Atlanta, and they restructured and she lost everything. Savings, equity, pension, all of it, 3 weeks before her options vested. Her voice was steady but thin, like something stretched past its comfortable range. You never knew that about me. You never asked. The room breathed. Gavin sat down on the couch. Not a controlled sit, a descent, the way people sit when their legs have decided they're done bearing weight. He sat and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor of his expensive apartment and felt the particular quality of a man who has been outmaneuvered on so many levels simultaneously that his brain is struggling to process which direction the outmaneuvering came from. His wife, his girlfriend. 8 months. The information flowing between them, not stolen, not hacked, simply given. One careful document at a time by the woman he'd been sharing a bed with while his wife built the case that would end him. He thought about Nora calling Vanessa. Nora, who had never raised her voice in 12 years of marriage, finding the one person inside his own operation who had a reason to turn and asking her a single, unadorned question. Can you live with it? It wasn't strategy. It was something that understood people better than strategy did. She's going to protect you, he said. Not a question. Vanessa looked at him. What? Nora, whatever arrangement you have with her, she's going to protect you from the board investigation, from the SEC. He looked up at her. She agreed to that. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, then, she said the employees come first, that anything I'd provided to help protect them would be considered cooperation, not... She said it exactly like that. The employees come first. Yes. He laughed. A short, compressed sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like air escaping from something that had been sealed too long. Of course she did, he said. He stood up, straightened his jacket. The physical habit of a man who has been composing himself from the outside in for so long that it happens automatically, even now. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the lights of the city. His city, the city he'd conquered in the specific way that men conquer cities, by making enough money that the city begins to feel like it belongs to them, which is not actually the same as belonging. "Get out," he said. "Gavin, Vanessa." He didn't turn around. "I'm not angry at you. I want you to understand that." He paused. "I think I knew some part of me when she called you. I think I knew she wouldn't miss. She never misses." Another pause. "But I need you to go, and I need you to not contact me. Not tonight. Not for a while." He heard her pick up her bag, heard her hesitate at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "I didn't think she'd give you anything. I assumed she'd take everything. That's what the plan was designed for." A beat. "She changed it. At the last minute, apparently. She added the protection parameters for the employees. She told the forensic attorney what to exclude. She built in the board review structure that keeps the company viable." Vanessa paused. "She protected the company, Gavin. The company you built. Even after what you did to it." The door closed. Gavin stood at the window for a long time. The night was clear enough that he could see the harbor, the same harbor he'd looked at from the conference room this afternoon, when a forensic accountant was going through his financial records and a board chairman was asking him questions he couldn't answer honestly. He'd built this view. He'd chosen it, paid for it, earned it in the most literal sense. It was the direct result of 20 years of work, of a genuine idea that had become a genuine company, corrupted at some point by his fear that genuine wasn't going to be enough. His phone buzzed. Not a call this time. A notification from a financial monitoring app, the kind that tracked account balances and flagged unusual activity. He'd set it up years ago to watch competitors. He looked at it now. The notification was about his personal accounts, not the offshore structure. Those were frozen, Walsh had told him that. His personal accounts. The ones at 3 different American banks. The ones that held his liquid assets separate from the company equity. Every account showed the same message. Account access temporarily restricted pending regulatory review. He read it 3 times. He opened the banking app, then a second one, then his investment account. All 3 showing the same restriction, all 3 time-stamped within the last 40 minutes. He did the math in his head. Rapidly, desperately, with the specific arithmetic of a man calculating what he has left. The company equity was worthless in the short term. Even if the board didn't remove him, the stock would crater in the morning when the Globe story ran. The offshore accounts were frozen, and now the domestic personal accounts were restricted. He had the penthouse. He had the car. He had whatever cash was in his wallet, which was $240, because men with penthouse apartments in Back Bay don't carry much cash. He had been, as of 9 this morning, worth approximately $41 million. He stared at the restriction notice on his phone and understood that the number was now, for all practical purposes, theoretical. He called his accountant. Voicemail. He called his private banker. Voicemail. He called the crisis attorney, Helena Strauss, who picked up because that was what $500 an hour bought you. "The personal accounts," he said. "I heard." Her voice was alert. She was clearly already working. "It's a precautionary hold. It doesn't mean—" "Helena, can I access any of my money tonight?" A pause. "Not tonight," she said. He sat down on the floor. Not the couch. The floor with his back against the window, the cold radiating through the glass behind him. He sat on the floor of his $14 million penthouse with $240 in his wallet and thought about the sequence of the day. The courthouse. The ring on the marble floor, the folder under Nora's arm, the board meeting, the second envelope, Vanessa, and now this. Not chaos. He understood that now. Not chaos at all. A sequence. Each element precisely placed, precisely timed, each one triggering the next like a mechanism that had been wound and set, and all it needed was the right moment to be released. The divorce proceedings. That had been the moment. The moment she walked out of that courtroom with the folder was the moment she released the mechanism, and every domino he was watching fall had been standing in its position for months, years, waiting. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it because he had stopped having the energy to be selective. Mr. Cross, a man's voice, not Agent Walsh, someone new. My name is Thomas Greer. I'm a partner at Greer Whitfield. I'm reaching out on behalf of a client who has an interest in your current situation. Who's your client? Gavin said. I'm not authorized to name them tonight. What I can tell you is that my client is aware of the board's likely action tomorrow morning and is in a position to make a significant acquisition offer for Cross Meridian within the next 72 hours. A pause. An offer that would result in considerable personal benefit to you, under the right circumstances. Gavin's eyes were closed. His head was back against the cold glass. What kind of offer? The kind that prioritizes asset value over operational continuity, Greer said carefully. My client is primarily interested in the IP portfolio and the core engineering patents. The operational infrastructure, the offices, the staff arrangements, would be subject to restructuring post-acquisition. Subject to restructuring. 200 people, their jobs, their equity, their vesting schedules that were now, in the chaos of the day's events, more precarious than they'd been this morning. Gavin opened his eyes. I'll have my attorney contact you, he said. The reflex again. The professional reflex that runs on its own track beneath the disaster. Of course. One more thing, Mr. Cross. Greer's voice was pleasant in the practiced way of attorneys who have learned to deliver bad news cheerfully. My client asked that you move quickly. There is another party that has expressed interest in the company. A legitimate acquisition through a corporate structure. My client's offer would need to precede that one, and the board vote tomorrow morning somewhat constrains the timeline. Who's the other party? Gavin said. I'm not in a position. Who is it? A brief pause. A multinational firm called Harwell Partners, Greer said. European-based, recent American expansion. They've been very quiet about it, but they've apparently been watching Cross Meridian for some time. He paused again. They seem particularly interested in the company's operational integrity. Employees, culture, continuity. The word continuity carried a faint note of professional skepticism, as if Greer found the concept slightly quaint. My client's offer, by contrast, is cleaner, simpler, more immediately lucrative for the relevant stakeholders. The call ended. Gavin sat on the floor for another minute. Then he got up, walked to his desk, opened his laptop and typed Harwell Partners into a search engine and spent 20 minutes going through what existed publicly, which was not much, but which included a corporate registration in Luxembourg and a U.S. subsidiary registered 18 months ago in Delaware, with a Boston office address, and a board of directors that was a list of legitimate names from the European corporate world, and at the bottom of the Delaware registration, listed as a passive investor in the American subsidiary with a stake of just over 40%. A holding company called Moretti Capital Advisors, LLC. Gavin Cross sat very still and looked at the screen. Lorenzo Moretti wasn't just sending armored SUVs and cold stares. He was maneuvering on the financial board with the same quiet patience that his sister had demonstrated in 12 years of marriage. Building, positioning, waiting, and then offering not a threat but a choice. A clean, legitimate, above-board choice between two acquisition offers, one that would gut the company and pay Gavin well, and one that would protect every employee and pay Gavin considerably less. He had been wrong about the nature of the attack. He'd been watching the front door while the real move came through every other entrance simultaneously. Nora hadn't wanted to destroy him. She'd wanted to architect a situation in which his only remaining choice was between his money and his humanity. She was going to make him choose. Publicly. In front of a board he no longer controlled, with 200 people's futures on the table and the cameras from the globe waiting outside. And she was going to do it without Lorenzo making a single threat, without a single act of violence, without anything that could be characterized as coercion, because the offer would be genuine, Harwell would be legitimate, and the decision would be entirely, completely, damnably his. Gavin Cross stared at the Moretti Capital Advisors listing on his laptop screen and felt something move through him that he had not felt since he was young and broke and building something real in a Cambridge basement. Something that felt distantly and uncomfortably like being seen. His phone rang again. This time he recognized the number. It was Doug Harrell, his CFO. The man who had not returned calls all day, who had apparently been terrified since this morning when an envelope arrived. Gavin answered. "Doug," he said, "I need to tell you something." Harold's voice was shaking, not with fear, with the particular tremor of someone who has been holding something back for a long time and has finally reached the point where holding it back costs more than releasing it. "I need to tell you something I should have told you 6 months ago." Gavin waited. "She came to me," Harold said. "Nora, last spring. She came to me and she had documents. I don't know how she got them. I still don't know. And she showed me what the Hendricks deal was going to do to the pension structure for the non-executive employees, the ones below VP level, the ones who trusted—" His voice cracked. "I have people on my team who've been here since we were 12 people in Cambridge, Gavin. People who turned down other jobs because I told them this company was going to take care of them." Gavin closed his eyes. "She asked me to provide her with the internal Q4 documentation," Harold said. "She said she had everything else. She just needed the financial reporting trail to make the SEC case airtight. She said—" He stopped, started again. "She said she would make sure nobody in finance was implicated, that the investigation would be scoped to protect the department heads who weren't part of the Hendricks planning." A long pause. "I gave her what she asked for. I've been waiting every day since for the moment you found out. I'm sorry. I'm not— I know that doesn't—" "Doug." Gavin's voice was very quiet. Harold stopped. "How many people on your team knew about the Hendricks vesting timing?" Gavin asked. A pause. "3. Maybe 4. Did any of them know what it meant? What we were planning?" A longer pause this time. "I think they suspected," Harold said. "They didn't say anything to me, but I think they knew." Gavin sat with that for a moment. The picture it painted of his own company, the people who had worked for him, who had said nothing, who had watched and suspected and gone to their desks every day and done their jobs while carrying the weight of what they thought might be coming. "Go home, Doug," he said. "Gavin, go home. Get some sleep. Be at the board meeting tomorrow." He paused. "And Doug, whatever happens tomorrow, you did the right thing." He ended the call. The penthouse was very quiet. The city lights were steady outside the window, indifferent and permanent. Gavin Cross sat in the wreckage of the most carefully constructed life he knew how to build and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that tomorrow morning's board meeting was not a trial. It was a test, and every version of himself that he had built since the Cambridge basement was going to walk into that room, and only one of them was going to walk back out, and he had no idea yet which one it was going to be. His laptop screen was still open on the Moretti Capital Advisors registration. He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he opened a new browser tab and typed in the address of the Hendricks Group, the firm that wanted to buy his company and strip it clean and walk away with the patents while 200 people collected unemployment. And he sat there looking at their website, at the clean corporate language and the confident photography and the mission statement about maximizing value for stakeholders. And something moved in his chest that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief, but was in the same neighborhood as both. He was still sitting there at 2 a.m. when his phone buzzed one final time. No number, a text from an address that was nothing but digits. "The board meets at 8. You have 1 vote left that matters. Think about who you were before you were afraid." He stared at the message. He knew who had sent it, knew it the way he knew almost nothing else with certainty tonight. He put the phone face down on the desk and sat in the dark of his expensive, empty apartment, and for the first time in 12 years, in the silence that Nora Hayes had always been comfortable with, and he had always filled with noise, he simply sat and thought. He didn't sleep, not a single hour. He sat at the desk until 4 a.m. and then moved to the window and stood there until 6 and watched the city transition from darkness to the particular gray half-light of a Boston November dawn that doesn't so much arrive as accumulate. Light building slowly behind the clouds until suddenly there's enough of it to see by, though the sun itself never actually appears. At 6:15 he showered. At 6:40 he put on a suit, not the best one, not the power suit he wore to quarterly earnings calls and investor presentations, but an older one, charcoal, slightly worn at the left cuff, One he'd kept without quite knowing why. He stood in front of the mirror and looked at himself for a long moment, and then left without eating. The building was different at 7:30 in the morning. The lobby security guard, a man named Arthur, who had been working the desk for 6 years and who Gavin had never once asked about his family, looked up when Gavin came through the doors and then looked away, which was new. Arthur had always made eye contact, had always said good morning. The looking away was a data point, and it landed. The elevator was empty. Gavin rode it to the 42nd floor and stepped out into a hallway that had 3 people in it who all found reasons to be looking somewhere else. The conference room was already occupied. Through the glass wall, he could see Calloway, Park, Mercer. Dr. Iris Chang, the forensic accountant, with a laptop open in front of her and stacks of printed documents arranged with the neat precision of someone who has been working since before dawn. 2 people he didn't recognize, attorneys from their posture, the particular way lawyers hold themselves in rooms where they are about to be useful, and at the far end of the table, a man in a dark suit who was not looking at his phone or his documents, but was simply sitting, hands folded, watching the door. Gavin didn't recognize him immediately. Then he did. Thomas Greer, the attorney who had called last night representing the unnamed client, the Hendricks Group buyer, the one who wanted the IP and the patents, and had no interest in operational continuity. He was here, in the room, already seated, already present, already positioned at the table as though he belonged there, which meant Calloway had invited him, which meant the board had already been in contact with the acquisition offer, which meant the vote this morning was not preliminary. It was final. Gavin pushed the door open. Every head turned. The quality of the attention in the room was the specific quality of people who have been discussing someone and have just been interrupted by the arrival of that person, the conversation still warm in the air between them. Gavin, Calloway stood. The gesture had the quality of a courtesy extended out of long habit rather than current warmth. Thank you for coming. It's my company, Gavin said. The words came out harder than he intended. He heard them land and didn't retract them. He sat down. Not at the head of the table, Waltz. Calloway was at the head, but in the middle of one side, which put him directly across from Thomas Greer, who met his eyes with the pleasant, neutral expression of a man who gets paid regardless of which direction things go. Before we begin, Mercer said, opening her legal pad, I want to be clear about the scope of this morning's session. The board has received 2 acquisition offers for Cross Meridian Technologies. We have also received the findings of Dr. Chang's preliminary forensic review. She looked at Gavin directly. And we have a resolution before us regarding the CEO position. Let's talk about the offers first, Gavin said. Calloway looked at him. Something shifted slightly in the older man's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The first offer, Mercer continued, is from Hendricks Capital Partners, represented here by Mr. Greer. The offer values Cross Meridian at $380 million with an 8% premium to the pre-announcement share price. Terms include IP acquisition and operational restructuring, Gavin said. I know the terms. Greer's expression didn't change. The second offer, Mercer said, is from Harwell Partners, a European-based multinational with an established American subsidiary. The offer values the company at $312 million, $68 million lower. She paused to let that land. Terms include full operational continuity, retention of all current employees at existing compensation levels for a minimum of 36 months, and acceleration of the employee stock vesting schedule to immediate full vesting upon acquisition completion. The room was quiet. Gavin looked at the table. The difference between the 2 offers was $68 million. $68 million, distributed primarily between himself as the controlling shareholder and the institutional investors. 200 people's jobs and their equity on one side. $68 million on the other. I want to see the Harwell corporate structure, he said. Park slid a document across the table without comment. Gavin looked at it. Harwell Partners. Luxembourg registration. Delaware subsidiary. The board of directors. The investor list. The 40.3% stake held by Moretti Capital Advisors, LLC. He studied the page as though he hadn't already spent 2 hours looking at it last night, because he needed the room to see him seeing it for the first time. The passive investor, he said, Moretti Capital. We're aware of the connection, Calloway said carefully. Are you? Gavin looked up at him. And the board is comfortable with that. The corporate structure is legitimate, Mercer said. Harwell has operated as a functioning multinational for 11 years. Their U.S. subsidiary has been audited twice by independent firms. There is no legal basis for— I'm not asking about legal basis. Gavin put the document down. I'm asking if the board understands who Lorenzo Moretti is. The room was quiet in a different way now. Greer, across the table, was watching Gavin with slightly more attention than before. Mr. Cross, Calloway said, the board's fiduciary responsibility is to evaluate the financial and operational merits of— Richard. Gavin's voice was quiet, but it cut through. I know who Lorenzo Moretti is. I met him yesterday on the courthouse steps. He's Nora's brother. He paused. My ex-wife's brother. And he is using a legitimate corporate structure to make a legitimate offer that would protect every employee in this company, their jobs, their vesting, their equity, because his sister asked him to. He looked around the table. I want that to be said out loud in this room. Not around, not implied. Out loud. The silence lasted several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, Park spoke. Does it change the offer's validity? No, Gavin said. Does it change the employee protections written into the terms? No. Then I'm not sure what you want us to say, Gavin. Gavin looked at him for a moment. David Park, the audit committee chair who had looked at Gavin's financial records yesterday with the expression of a man confirming something he had suspected for longer than he'd wanted to admit. Nothing, Gavin said. I just needed it said. Then the door opened. Not one of the attorneys, not a board member, not someone Gavin would have predicted. Vanessa Doyle walked into the conference room at 7:54 in the morning, wearing the specific look of someone who has made a decision they're not certain they can sustain and intends to sustain it anyway. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were clear in the particular way that eyes are clear after a night of crying, scrubbed clean, slightly raw at the edges, but steady. Behind her was a woman Gavin didn't recognize, mid-40s, practical suit, carrying a thin briefcase. Government posture. He'd been around enough federal people in the past 24 hours to recognize it. Agent Walsh is here at my request, Vanessa said. Her voice was even. She was looking at Gavin. I contacted her this morning. I've agreed to provide a full statement regarding my involvement in the Hendricks planning conversations and the Q4 reporting adjustments in exchange for cooperation consideration. She stopped. Her jaw tightened for a second, released. I'm not going to let you take this alone. That's not— She stopped again. That's not something I can do. Agent Diana Walsh set her briefcase on a chair along the wall and stood quietly, the way federal agents stand when they are not yet in the room professionally, but are about to be. Gavin looked at Vanessa. He thought about what she'd said last night. I have a sister. She worked 12 years for a company in Atlanta. And he thought about the text at 2 in the morning that he now knew Nora had sent. And he thought about the way the morning was assembling itself around him, each element arriving in sequence. And he understood that he was inside something that had been designed with the particular care of someone who understands not just strategy, but human beings. Nora hadn't just built a legal case. She'd built a moment. A specific, irreversible, public moment in which every person in Gavin Cross's life who had something left to lose or something left to prove would be in the same room at the same time. And Gavin would have to be the person he actually was in front of all of them. Sit down, Vanessa, Calloway said. His voice was tired but not unkind. She sat. Greer, across the table, was now consulting his phone under the table with the discreet urgency of a man texting his client that the situation had developed complications. Before we move to the vote, Mercer said, and she said it with the studied composure of someone determined to keep this morning on a procedural track regardless of what kept arriving through the door. I want to read into the record a statement that was submitted to the board this morning via Greta Solano, the attorney representing Nora Hayes. She picked up a single page. Gavin went very still. Ms. Hayes states the following, Mercer said. Quote, The purpose of the evidence provided to this board was not the destruction of cross-meridian technologies or the punishment of its founder. The purpose was to protect 200 employees whose financial futures were placed in jeopardy by decisions made without their knowledge or consent. I asked the board to consider the acquisition offer that best serves those employees. I asked that any investigation resulting from the forensic review scope its accountability to the individuals most responsible for the decisions made, and that it explicitly exclude lower-level employees and department heads who had no decision-making authority. I have no interest in the outcome of the vote beyond those two employees' protections. Whatever the board decides, I ask that it be decided on the merits of what serves the people who built this company, not on what serves anyone's desire for revenge, including my own. Mercer set the page down. The room was completely silent. Then Greer's phone buzzed, loud enough to be heard. He looked at it, pressed it flat against his thigh, looked up. If the board is ready to proceed to the vote, he said carefully, my client remains committed to the terms of its offer and is prepared to— Mr. Greer. Gavin's voice came out of him before he decided to speak. It was the voice from 2 a.m, the voice from 6 years ago in Cambridge when they were 12 people, and the money hadn't come yet, and what they had was just the work, just the actual thing they were building. What happens to the engineers? Greer blinked. I'm sorry? The engineering team, 43 people, average tenure 8 years. Gavin's eyes were on him without aggression, with something more uncomfortable than aggression, something that required more from the person being looked at. What happens to them under your client's terms? Post-acquisition restructuring would be at the discretion of— what happens to them? Greer's pleasant expression didn't waver. Realistically, in an IP-focused acquisition, the operational teams would be subject to review. They'd be laid off. The term, they'd be laid off. Gavin said it flat. Final. Within 90 days before their options vest. Mr. Cross, Greer said, your personal financial exposure and the differential between the two offers is— I know what it is. $68 million is— I know what it is. His voice was harder now. I've been doing this math since 2 o'clock this morning. The room was breathing in small, careful increments. Park had his hands flat on the table. Calloway was watching Gavin with the expression of a man watching something he'd given up expecting. Gavin looked at the Harwell document still in front of him. He looked at the Moretti Capital Advisors line. He thought about Lorenzo Moretti on the courthouse steps. She's my little sister. And he thought about Nora sitting across from him in a gray wool dress, watching a ring roll across marble, saying nothing, signing everything, walking out with a worn folder and 12 years of evidence that she had never once threatened to use. He thought about what it meant to build something real and then be afraid of it. He thought about the 43 engineers, about Doug Harrell's voice shaking on the phone last night, about Vanessa's sister in Atlanta, collecting unemployment at 31. He reached for the shareholder proxy form. His hand was not entirely steady. He was aware of it, the slight tremor, the physical tell that his body was registering what his mind had decided in the middle of the night, but hadn't said out loud until now. He picked up the pen anyway. Before I do this, he said, and his voice came out rough at the edges, I need to say something for the record. Mercer's pen was poised. I built something real, Gavin said. In the beginning, I built something that actually worked, that actually helped people do things they couldn't do before. And at some point, he stopped. The roughness in his voice was getting worse, and he pushed through it because stopping was not an option. At some point, I stopped trusting that it was enough, so I built something else on top of it, something that was only about protecting myself from the possibility that the real thing might not be enough. He looked at the proxy form, the offshore structure, the Hendricks planning, the vesting timing. He looked up. I did those things. Not my team, not Doyle, not Harrell. The decisions were mine. I want that in the record, explicitly. Agent Walsh along the wall was writing. Vanessa was looking at the table. Calloway's face had something in it that Gavin hadn't seen there in years, something that might have been grief, or something adjacent to grief. The specific sorrow of a person watching someone they once believed in arrive very late, at the place they should have been all along. Gavin signed the proxy form. He slid it across to Mercer. Harwell Partners, he said. The room exhaled. Greer closed his briefcase with a quiet click. He stood, straightened his jacket, nodded once with the professional composure of a man who loses transactions the same way he wins them, without visible investment in either, and left the room. The board vote took 11 minutes. It was 4-0. The fifth board member, who had recused himself due to a conflict, had left a written proxy that went the same direction, making it 5-0, which was the kind of number that didn't require interpretation. Cross Meridian Technologies would be acquired by Harwell Partners. All employees retained. Full vesting accelerated. The company, the actual thing Gavin Cross had built in a Cambridge basement when he was 26 years old and still capable of believing that the work was enough, would continue. In the hallway afterward, as the attorneys were filing out and Mercer was on her phone and Chiang was packing her documents with the same methodical calm she'd brought to unpacking them, Calloway stopped beside Gavin. He didn't say anything for a moment. They stood looking out the window at the harbor, the same view Gavin had looked at yesterday afternoon when the world was a different shape. "You know," Calloway said finally, "when you called me the first time, 2009, you were 30. You had this pitch about document management infrastructure, and you were so—" He stopped, shook his head. "You were so sure it mattered, that the thing you'd built actually mattered. I believed you because of that. The certainty." Gavin said nothing. "I missed her," Calloway said. "Nora, all these years, I always thought she was—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Underutilized." Gavin looked at him. "She came to one board dinner. I think it was 2018. She sat next to David Park, and they talked for 2 hours about supply chain ethics, and he told me afterward he'd never had a conversation that good at one of our events." Calloway paused. "I asked her once what she did, and she said she was working on a project. I didn't ask what kind." He looked at Gavin. "I should have asked." He walked away. Gavin stood at the window. His phone buzzed. Marcus Webb. He let it go to voicemail. Then Helena Strauss. He let that go too. Then Doug Harrell, and he picked that one up because Harrell had earned it. "It's done," Gavin said. Harrell was quiet for a second. "Harwell?" "Yes." Another second. Then, very quietly, Harrell said, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words, the same 2 Lorenzo had said to Nora on the courthouse steps. Gavin couldn't say anything in response to that. He stood at the window until the feeling passed. Then he took the elevator down and walked through the lobby where Arthur was at the desk. And this time Arthur looked up, and Gavin Cross, for the first time in 6 years of walking past this desk every morning, stopped and said, "Arthur, how are your kids?" Arthur blinked. Then he said, "They're good, Mr. Cross. Molly started high school this year." "That's something," Gavin said. He meant it. He didn't know why he meant it as much as he did, but he did. He walked out into the cold November air. His phone buzzed again. A text, from a number he now recognized. Not a name in his contacts, just a number, because she had never been anything in his contacts except wife, a label he'd applied and then stopped thinking about the way you stop thinking about labels once they've been applied long enough. "The letter will arrive tonight. You don't have to read it, but I think you should." He stood on the sidewalk outside his building, the same building he'd walked into 100 times without looking at it, and he read the text twice. He typed back, "I voted for Harwell." 3 minutes passed. The city moved around him. Cabs, pedestrians, a delivery truck, a woman with a stroller navigating the cracked sidewalk near the corner. Ordinary life at ordinary speed. Then, "I know." He stood there a moment longer. Then Agent Walsh appeared at his shoulder, which he had been expecting. She had the particular approach of a federal agent who has been professionally courteous throughout a process and is now moving into the phase where professional courtesy and legal obligation converge in a way that is somewhat less comfortable. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I'd like to schedule that conversation." "Yes," he said. "You can reach my attorney." He paused. "But I want to tell you something first. Without counsel, just—" He stopped. Exhaled. The cold air made it visible, a brief cloud that disappeared. "I want to tell you that the statement I made in the board meeting this morning, that the decisions were mine, I mean that. I'll say it again on record whenever you need me to." Walsh looked at him for a moment with the specific, evaluative attention of someone who has heard a lot of self-serving cooperation statements and is assessing where this one falls on the spectrum. "All right," she said, "and the offshore accounts, whatever the review requires." He put his phone in his pocket. "I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be." She nodded once, the nod of a professional who doesn't offer praise or condemnation but registers information. She handed him a card and walked away. Gavin Cross stood on the sidewalk outside the company he no longer controlled and looked at the card in his hand and felt, moving through the cold air of the morning, the very specific sensation of a man who has just lost nearly everything he spent his life accumulating and cannot locate. Despite several attempts, the feeling of regret that should theoretically accompany that loss. What he felt instead was something he had no good word for, something that sat in his chest like a coal. Not warm exactly, not burning, just present and real in a way that the $41 million and the Forbes profiles and the Back Bay penthouse had never quite managed to be. He started walking. He walked 6 blocks before he realized he had no destination, and then he kept walking anyway because the movement helped, because his body needed to be doing something while his mind worked through the mathematics of what came next. The federal process, the board transition, the acquisition timeline, the apartment he could no longer realistically afford, the question of who he was going to be on the other side of all of it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out without slowing down. The text was from a number he didn't recognize. No name, no preamble. A single photograph. He stopped walking. The photograph was of Nora. Not recent. It had the quality of something taken years ago, the colors slightly different, the resolution older. She was standing somewhere that looked like an airport, and she was looking at the camera not with a posed expression, but with the slightly unfocused look of someone who hasn't quite realized the photo is being taken. She was holding something. He enlarged the image with 2 fingers, brought it closer, and saw what she was holding. A manila folder. Not the same one. He could tell by the color, the thickness. A different one. Older. Which meant that the one she'd walked out of the courthouse with yesterday was not the first one she'd ever carried, was not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something. A habit of documentation and evidence building that went back further than 3 years, further than the Hendricks conversations, further than anything he had calculated last night when he'd been trying to understand the full architecture of what she'd done. He stared at the photograph. His phone rang. The number that had sent the photo. He answered. The voice on the line was a man's. Not Lorenzo, not anyone he'd heard before. Accented, careful. "Mr. Cross," the voice said, "my client wanted you to have that photograph." "Who's your client?" Gavin said. "My client prefers to remain anonymous for now. What matters is what the photograph shows." A pause. That folder in Ms. Hayes's hands, the one in the image, it was taken 6 years ago at Logan Airport. Another pause. She was leaving for New York for a meeting. 6 years ago. 6 years ago, Gavin Cross and Nora Hayes were 4 years away from the divorce, still living in the Back Bay penthouse, still attending the dinners and the events and the appearances that constituted their public marriage. 6 years ago, the Hendricks conversations hadn't happened yet. 6 years ago, the offshore structure was in its early architecture, and he told himself it was preliminary, theoretical, responsible management. 6 years ago, she had been building a folder. "What meeting?" Gavin said. His voice was absolutely flat. "With a woman named Elena Vasquez," the voice said. "A forensic financial investigator, formerly with the Department of Justice." A pause. "Ms. Hayes hired her privately 6 years ago to begin documenting the financial architecture of Cross Meridian Technologies, the offshore structure, the licensing arrangements, the reporting adjustments." The voice was measured, deliberate, and careful in the way that voices are careful when the speaker has been told exactly how much to say. She didn't start building the case when she decided to leave Mr. Cross. She started building it when she decided to stay and see what you would become. Gavin Cross stood on a sidewalk in Boston in the November cold and felt the ground shift under him in a way it hadn't shifted even yesterday, even in the conference room, even at 2 a.m. staring at a laptop screen. 6 years. She had stayed. She had been present at the dinners and the events, and the quiet evenings he'd barely registered. And simultaneously, in the parts of her life he'd never thought to ask about, she had been building something with the patience and the precision of someone who understood that the truth has its own timeline and can't be rushed, only prepared for. She had not stayed because she didn't know. She had stayed because she was watching, because she wanted to understand the full shape of what he was capable of before she decided what to do about it. Because the woman he'd dismissed as having no contribution had been, for 6 years, conducting the most thorough investigation of his professional life. "Who are you?" Gavin said. "That doesn't matter," the voice said. "Why are you telling me this?" A pause, longer than the others. "Because my client believes you made the right vote this morning," the voice said. "And my client wants to make sure you understand exactly what you voted against, not just the Hendricks offer." A breath. But 6 years of evidence that, had Nora Hayes chosen to use it differently, could have resulted in something significantly worse than a board vote in a federal investigation. The line went quiet but didn't disconnect. Gavin looked at the photograph on his phone. Nora at an airport, not quite aware of the camera, holding a folder that had been the beginning of everything that had ended his morning. "She could have destroyed me," he said. Not a question. "Completely," the voice confirmed. "Years ago." "Yes." He stood there for another moment. "Then why didn't she?" The pause this time was the longest yet. "You'll have to ask her that yourself," the voice said. The line went dead. Gavin Cross stood on the sidewalk with his phone warm in his cold hand and the photograph of his ex-wife on the screen, and 6 years rearranging themselves in his memory, like furniture being moved in a room he thought he knew. All the same pieces, but nothing where he'd believed it to be, and the room itself a completely different shape than the one he'd been living in. "The letter," she'd said. "The letter will arrive tonight." He looked at his watch. It was 9:47 in the morning. He had the rest of the day, and the question of what to do with it was pressing against him from all directions. He started walking again. He walked for 2 hours without stopping, without destination, through the cold November streets of a city that had no opinion about him, past coffee shops and dry cleaners, and a school where children were arriving in coats and backpacks, while parents stood on the sidewalk checking phones, past a small park where an old man was feeding pigeons with methodical patience, past a construction site where workers in orange vests were doing something precise and physical with their hands in the cold. He walked until his feet hurt, until the cold had gotten into his jacket and his jaw ached from clenching against it, until he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the sleepless night and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 20 years moving in one direction and has just, in the space of a single morning, turned completely around. Then he found a diner. Not a restaurant, a diner, the kind with laminate tables and coffee and ceramic mugs, and a menu that hasn't changed in 30 years. And he went inside and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs, and ate them slowly while the morning moved around him. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, Gavin Cross sat in an ordinary place and was not performing anything for anyone. His phone buzzed at 11:30. A delivery notification. Not tonight. Now. A courier service requesting a signature. He looked at the address listed. The diner was 2 blocks away. He left a 20 on the counter, too much for what he'd ordered, but the woman behind the counter had refilled his coffee without being asked, and that seemed worth acknowledging. And he walked out into the cold and around the corner and found the courier, a young man on a bicycle who was checking his phone and looked up when Gavin approached. "Cross," the courier said. "Yes." An envelope. Letter-sized, cream-colored, sealed, no return address. His name in handwriting he recognized immediately, the precise, slightly leftward tilt of someone who had taught herself to write carefully because she'd believed, when she was young, that handwriting said something about who you were. The courier was already gone. Gavin stood on the sidewalk holding the envelope. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened it. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, the same careful script on the envelope. He read it standing on the sidewalk in the cold because sitting down felt wrong, felt like something that required a privacy and a stillness he wasn't ready to claim. She wrote the way she'd always spoken to him in the early years, directly, without decoration, without the careful management of his feelings that she'd learned to employ later as the marriage became something that required management. She wrote about the 6 years. She told him about Elena Vasquez, about the decision she'd made when she'd first understood the offshore structure, about the moment she'd chosen to stay and watch rather than leave and act. She wrote that she had not stayed because she loved him enough to wait. She had stayed because she needed to understand if there was a line he wouldn't cross. If there was a version of Gavin Cross, somewhere inside the one she'd married, that had enough of the original person in it to stop before the worst thing. She wrote, "I wanted to be wrong about what you were becoming. I stayed 6 years hoping to be wrong. I wasn't wrong about what you were becoming, but I was wrong about whether you could come back from it. That's what this morning told me." And then, "I don't love you. I want to be honest about that. I won't tell you what I feel for you now because I don't have a clean word for it. It's not love, and it's not hate, and it's not indifference. It's something that only exists between people who have known each other for a very long time and have hurt each other in ways that can't be repaired but can, eventually, be understood. I think, eventually, I will understand. I think you will too." And at the end, one paragraph. "Don't reach out to me. Not for a long time. You'll know when enough time has passed because it will feel different. Not like reaching out to fix something, but like reaching out just to reach out, which is what people do when the thing between them has finally settled into something honest. I'll be reachable when that happens. I think you'll know the difference. Take care of yourself, Gavin. I mean that with everything in me. Nora." He stood on the sidewalk for a long time after he finished reading. The cold was significant now. His hands were numb at the fingertips, the letter slightly warped from being held too tightly. A cab went past. A woman with a dog. 2 men in hard hats coming out of the construction site he'd passed 2 hours ago, laughing about something. He folded the letter carefully, put it in his inside jacket pocket, close to his chest, next to the worn fabric at the left cuff. He thought about what she'd written, about 6 years of watching, about a woman who had stayed in a difficult place not out of weakness, but out of the specific, disciplined patience of someone who needed to understand the full truth before she acted on it. About the vote this morning and what it had meant and what she'd said it told her. He thought about the line she'd written. "I was wrong about whether you could come back from it," and felt it move through him in a way that was not comfortable and was not meant to be comfortable, but was, underneath the discomfort, something he recognized as true. He started walking again. He didn't know where he was going. That was fine. That was possibly the most honest thing about the day. That he was moving without a destination. That the man who had always had the next 3 moves planned was, for the first time, simply in motion without a plan. And the city was receiving him without judgment. And the cold was what it was. And somewhere across town, a woman with a worn manila folder and 12 years of patience was already building whatever came next. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Helena Strauss. He let it ring and kept walking, and the November morning moved around him, and everything he had built was behind him, and everything that came next was ahead, and for the moment, just this moment, the space between those 2 things was where he lived. Then Strauss called again, and he picked up, because the space between things doesn't last forever and there was work to be done, and he had decided sometime between 2 in the morning and the diner and the letter that he was going to do it differently this time. He just had to figure out what differently looked like. "Helena," he said. "We need to talk," she said. "Walsh's office called. They want you in for a formal session Thursday, and there's something else." A pause. The Harwell acquisition team reached out for an introductory conversation about the transition advisory role. Another pause. "They want to know if you'd be willing to stay on in a limited capacity, non-executive, mentorship-focused, no operational authority." He stopped walking. "Did they specify?" he said carefully. "Who requested that?" Strauss was quiet for a beat. The request came from the Harwell operational team, but the note attached to it mentioned that the suggestion originated with someone described as, she paused, and he heard the slight sound of her reading, "a person with a significant interest in the company's employee continuity outcomes." He stood on the sidewalk. He thought about 2 pages of careful handwriting and a woman at an airport 6 years ago with a folder under her arm, and the specific unreadable quality of a person who plans 12 moves ahead and still somehow manages to leave room for the people in the game to surprise her. "Tell them yes," he said. He put his phone in his pocket. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold for another moment, and then he turned and walked back toward whatever came next, and the city moved around him like it always had, indifferent, constant, entirely unimpressed. And the letter in his inside pocket was warm against his ribs, in the specific way that things are warm when they have been held close long enough. The federal process was not cinematic. That was the first thing Gavin Cross learned about it, that the machinery of legal accountability, when you are inside it rather than watching it from a safe distance, is slow and bureaucratic and deeply, persistently undramatic. There were no confrontations in marble hallways, no moments where a prosecutor leaned across a table and said something devastating that changed everything. There were instead conference rooms that smelled like recycled air and bad coffee, and documents, enormous quantities of documents, and attorneys speaking in the careful, qualified language of people who have learned that precision is the only protection against the ways that words can be used against you. Agent Walsh's office was on the 7th floor of a federal building in downtown Boston that had all the architectural ambition of a filing cabinet. Gavin went there on Thursday, as requested, with Helena Strauss beside him, and he told the truth. Not a managed version of it, not a shaped version, not the version that minimized his role and distributed responsibility across a team. The truth. All of it. The offshore structure, the Hendricks timeline, the vesting calculation that he had done himself on a spreadsheet in his home office at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night 2 years ago, with Nora reading in the next room and the city quiet outside. Walsh listened. Her associate took notes. Strauss occasionally touched Gavin's arm in the way attorneys touch clients when clients are saying things that are legally risky but factually necessary, the touch of someone who has accepted that their client has made a decision they can't reverse. The session lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Walsh set down her pen and looked at Gavin across the table with the evaluative attention he'd come to recognize as her primary mode of engagement. "Mr. Cross," she said, "in my experience, people in your position tend to arrive here having decided in advance exactly how much truth they're willing to provide. They've run the math, calculated the minimum viable disclosure." She paused. "You did not do that today." "No," he said. "May I ask why?" He thought about the letter in his jacket pocket, where he'd been carrying it for 2 days now, slightly more creased than when it arrived. He thought about a specific line. "I was wrong about whether you could come back from it. Because someone I used to know did me the favor of believing I still could," he said, "and I didn't want to make her wrong." Walsh looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something, and he had no idea what it was, and it turned out not to matter as much as he'd expected. The cooperation agreement took 3 weeks to finalize. It was not a get-out-of-jail arrangement. Strauss had been clear about that from the beginning, and Gavin had been clear that he understood. There would be consequences. The offshore structure would be unwound, the redirected assets recovered as fully as possible, penalties assessed. He would face a consent decree with the SEC. His ability to serve as an officer or director of a public company would be suspended for 7 years. He would pay, in the most literal sense of the word. The number, when Strauss finally told him what the settlement figure looked like, was large enough that the penthouse went on the market the following week. He didn't mind the penthouse. He minded it less than he'd expected. He found a 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, near the university, 4 blocks from the basement where Cross Meridian had started, and he signed a lease and moved in with what fit in the back of a rented van, which was not very much and felt, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, like a relief. Vanessa's cooperation agreement was finalized before his. She had provided more, given more, carried more of the evidentiary weight, and her exposure was proportionally reduced. He heard this from Strauss and felt nothing complicated about it. She had earned what she got. They did not speak during the process. He did not expect they would speak afterward, and he found that he was at peace with that the particular relationship they'd had, built as it was on the same foundation of fear and self-protection that had corrupted everything else he'd touched in those years, could not survive becoming honest without ceasing to be what it had been. Which was fine. which was possibly the best outcome available. Doug Harrell kept his job. The Harwell acquisition team, true to the terms, reviewed the finance department and found that the decision-making authority had been sufficiently concentrated at the top to allow the department heads to be classified as witnesses rather than participants. Harrell called Gavin the week the acquisition closed, and the call lasted 3 minutes, and neither of them said anything particularly significant, and that was the most significant call Gavin had in that period. The acquisition itself closed on a Tuesday in February, 41 days after the board vote, which was fast for a transaction of that size. Fast enough that Gavin understood, without being told, that someone had applied pressure to the process from the side of the Harwell corporate structure, and that the pressure had been applied specifically to ensure the employee vesting acceleration happened before the end of the fiscal quarter. He heard, through Strauss, who heard it from Greta Solano, who did not volunteer the information but did not deny it when asked, that the acceleration of the closing timeline had been suggested by someone in the Harwell investor group. He did not ask which investor. He already knew. The morning the acquisition closed, he was in Cambridge, sitting at the desk in his one-bedroom apartment with a cup of coffee and a second-hand chair that was not comfortable but was functional, reviewing the onboarding materials that the Harwell transition team had sent him for the advisory role. The role was narrow. No operational authority, no executive function, no board representation. He would mentor mid-level managers. He would be available as a resource on the company's history and technical architecture for the engineering teams that Harwell was integrating. He would attend no press events, make no public statements, have no visible role in the company's external presentation. It was, objectively, a considerable diminishment from where he'd been. He sat with his coffee and read the onboarding materials and found that he was genuinely interested in them. That the questions they raised, how do you integrate two engineering cultures without losing what either of them built? How do you preserve institutional memory during a transition? How do you tell 43 engineers that the work they've been doing matters to people who have just bought the company and could have gutted it but didn't? Were questions he actually wanted to think about, not because they served his interests, because they were real questions about real people, and he had spent enough time operating in the space where real people were abstractions that the return to concreteness felt like something he hadn't known he was hungry for. He had been in the advisory role for 3 weeks when Elena Vasquez called him. He didn't know the name at first. It was only when she introduced herself, former DOJ forensic investigator, currently private practice, that he placed it, and then he placed it very specifically. The name from the anonymous voice on the phone. The woman Nora had hired 6 years ago, the beginning of everything. "Ms. Hayes asked me to call you," Vasquez said. Her voice was businesslike and direct. "She's been reviewing the forensic recovery work we did on the offshore accounts. The DOJ has recovered approximately 63% of the redirected assets. The remaining 37% is tied up in the Cayman structure and will take time." "I know," Gavin said. "My attorney has kept me current." "There's something you don't know," Vasquez said. "Ms. Hayes has been working with the recovery team to designate the recovered assets, where they go once the penalties are settled and the victims' fund is established." A pause. "She's asked that a significant portion, be directed to a foundation she's establishing." "The Hayes Foundation," Gavin said. A short silence. "You've heard of it," Vasquez said. "I heard she was planning something." He hadn't heard the name until this moment. He sat with it for a second. Hayes Foundation. Her name, not Cross, the name she'd been born with and had returned to. "What does she want me to know about it?" "She doesn't want you to know anything specific about it," Vasquez said. "She asked me to call because there's a legal consideration. Some of the assets being directed to the foundation are derived from your corporate holdings. Your attorneys will need to sign off on the allocation." A beat. "But she also asked me to tell you what the foundation does." He waited. "Emergency legal assistance for women leaving difficult situations," Vasquez said. "Financial literacy programs, emergency housing partnerships, career development resources. She's partnered with 3 law schools for the legal assistance arm and 2 credit unions for the financial programs." Another pause. "It opens in April. She already has a waiting list." Gavin set his coffee down on the desk. He looked at the wall of his Cambridge apartment. No art on it yet. He hadn't gotten around to it, or possibly hadn't wanted to make choices that felt permanent. A blank wall. White? Nothing. "Tell her I'll sign whatever the attorneys need," he said. "I will." Vasquez was quiet for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then, she also said, and I'm quoting her here, so this is her language, not my characterization. She said to tell you that the foundation is not named after her to claim credit. It's named after her to remind her that she did this as herself, not as someone's wife. A pause. She thought you'd understand what that meant. He understood exactly what it meant. "Tell her I do," he said. The call ended. He sat in the apartment for a long time after that. The Cambridge streets were quiet outside his window. Late afternoon in winter, the light going early the way it did in February, the trees stripped and the sidewalks empty, the city in the particular suspended state of a cold weekday afternoon when everyone is either at work or inside. He thought about what Vanessa had said on the night of the board meeting, that Nora had changed the plan at the last minute, had added the protection parameters, had built in the structures that kept the company viable. He thought about Vasquez, hired 6 years ago, the beginning of a long and patient documentation of everything he'd built and everything he'd corrupted, and the specific decision Nora had made to use it as a lever rather than a weapon. He thought about what kind of person you had to be to do that, to carry that much knowledge for that long and still choose, when the moment came, to use it in the way that served other people rather than the way that served yourself. To sit across a table from the man who had thrown your ring across a courthouse floor and call himself a burden, and sign the papers quietly and walk out with the folder, and do it because you had already decided 6 years ago what you were going to use the folder for, and it had nothing to do with him. He picked up his phone and almost called her. Stopped himself. Not yet. She told him he'd know the difference. Not when he wanted to fix something, but when he just wanted to reach out. It wasn't that yet. He still wanted, underneath everything, to fix something, to say the right words that would reconstruct what he'd broken. That was not the reaching out she'd described. That was still the old habit. He put the phone down and sat with the want and the restraint, and after a while the restraint became easier, and he went back to the onboarding documents, and the afternoon moved into evening. Spring came slowly that year. March was cold and wet, and Boston was not kind about it. April arrived without much enthusiasm, the trees making tentative gestures toward leaves that retreated again when the temperature dropped. But by the middle of April, the light was different, longer, with actual warmth in it, the kind of light that changes how streets look and how people move through them. The Hayes Foundation opened on April 14th. Gavin knew the date because Greta Solano's office had sent the document execution paperwork at the end of March, and the cover letter had mentioned the opening date in the context of the timeline for the asset allocation. He did not attend. He was not invited, and he had not expected to be. He read a small item about it in the Globe, not front page, not even the main business section, a short piece about a new nonprofit on the South End, accompanied by a photograph of a storefront with clean windows and a simple sign and a line of women that extended around the corner of the building and down the block. He looked at the photograph for a long time. You couldn't see Nora in it. She might have been inside, or behind the camera, or somewhere else entirely. The line of women was the photograph. That was the story. He understood why. He clipped the article, actually clipped it, with scissors, from the physical paper he still had delivered out of a habit he hadn't bothered to break, and put it in his desk drawer. He did not fully understand why he did this either, but it seemed like something worth keeping. The advisory role settled into a rhythm over the spring. He came in 3 days a week, sat with the engineering teams, answered questions about decisions made years ago that were now the foundation someone else was building on. He was, in these conversations, remarkably honest about the decisions that had been wrong, the calls he'd made that he wouldn't make the same way, the places where he'd optimize for his own comfort rather than the company's actual health. The engineers received this honesty with the mild surprise of people who have been trained to expect defensiveness from people in his former position. A few of them began to seek him out specifically, not for validation, for the kind of conversation where someone who has done a thing badly and understands why can be useful to someone who is trying to do it well. He was not good at this immediately. He had habits to unlearn, the reflex to steer conversations toward conclusions that served his narrative, the instinct to frame his failures as learning opportunities in the way that self-help language frames things, which is to say, by removing the weight from them. He worked at it. He came in early and stayed late, not to demonstrate effort, but because the actual work of helping people build something that was going to outlast him in any form he'd recognize, had become the thing that made the days feel like something. He ran into Lorenzo Moretti once. Only once. In a coffee shop near the Harwell offices on a Tuesday morning in May when the weather had finally decided to commit to being warm. Lorenzo was at a corner table with two men Gavin didn't recognize, and he looked up when Gavin came in, and their eyes met across the room, and Gavin stopped. Lorenzo did not stand. He looked at Gavin for a long moment with those cold, assessing eyes that had not changed since the courthouse steps in November. The eyes of a man who has already made every decision he intends to make about you and is simply monitoring for new information. Gavin crossed the room. He stopped at the edge of the table. The two men with Lorenzo went still in the specific, watchful way of people who are very good at responding to signals that haven't been given yet. "Mr. Moretti," Gavin said. Lorenzo said nothing, just looked at him. "I want to say one thing," Gavin said, "and then I'll leave you alone." Still nothing. "She didn't need you to save her," Gavin said. "She never did. But I'm glad she had someone who would have." He paused. "And I'm glad she stopped you, for what it's worth." Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. No thaw, no acknowledgement, nothing cinematic. But something in it shifted by a fraction, the way a door shifts when the wind changes direction, just enough to register. "Get your coffee, Cross," Lorenzo said. His voice was neutral. Not warm, not hostile. Neutral, which was more than Gavin had expected. Gavin went to the counter and ordered his coffee and left without looking back. Outside in the May sunshine, he stood on the sidewalk and breathed the spring air and thought that neutral was enough. That neutral, from a man like Lorenzo Moretti, was not a small thing. It was, in its way, a form of acknowledgement that carried real weight, and he would take it. He was mentoring a young project manager named Kezia Okafor when the moment he'd been waiting for finally arrived. Kezia was 28, 2 years into the company, with the specific combination of technical precision and people instinct that Gavin recognized as the thing that made some people builders and others merely competent. She had started coming to him with questions in March, and by May their sessions had become a weekly standing appointment in a small conference room on the 38th floor where the view was of the financial district rather than the harbor, which Gavin found he preferred. They were discussing a personnel conflict on her team, a senior engineer who was technically excellent and interpersonally difficult in ways that were beginning to affect output. When Gavin's phone lit up on the table, he saw the name. He'd added it to his contacts 3 months ago, not because he intended to call it, but because he wanted to know when it called him. Nora Hayes. He looked at it. Keziah, across the table, said, "Do you need to—" "1 minute," he said. He picked up the phone and walked out to the hallway. "Nora," he said. "Gavin." Her voice was the same. He'd expected it to sound different, more distant, more official, marked somehow by everything that had happened. It sounded like her. "I'm not calling about the foundation paperwork. That's handled." "Okay," he said. "I'm calling because I'm standing outside the Middlesex County Courthouse." A pause. "I just finished a hearing. We got emergency housing for 17 women from a shelter that lost its city contract last week. The judge ruled in our favor." Another pause. "And I was standing on the steps and I thought about last November, about different courthouse steps." He stood in the hallway of the 38th floor with his hand against the wall and his eyes closed. "I know," he said. "I'm not calling to relitigate anything," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm calling because—" She stopped. He heard her exhale. "I'm calling because I was standing there and I felt something I couldn't explain. And I needed to tell someone. And the person I wanted to tell was you. And I'm not sure what that means yet, but I thought, Another stop. I thought being honest about it was the right thing. It is, he said. Don't make this into something, she said. A warning, not hostile, careful. The care of someone who has built something fragile and knows it. I'm not ready for this to be something. I know, he said. I just wanted to tell you, she said, that the work is good, that it's the best thing I've ever done, and that I'm okay. I wanted you to know that. He thought about the letter. I'll be reachable when that happens. He thought about whether this was that moment or something still earlier, still more tentative, still becoming whatever it was going to be. Nora, he said. Yes. I'm glad, he said. I'm genuinely, completely glad. A pause. You sound different, she said. I am different. Don't oversell it, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood as both, and it was the most real thing he'd heard in months. I'm not selling anything, he said. I'm retired from that. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. Short, barely there, but there. I have to go, she said. We have an intake appointment at 3. Go,